I was given the rules the first day, like you should call 5 minutes per month. Your first 3 salaries, the first 3 months, will be taken from you. So it reached a point I was like, why are you taking my salary? And they say they paid the agent, so they cannot give you the money before 3 months are over. Yeah. So the 3 months were like, and 5 minutes per month calling your family. Yeah. Again, the rules also, you are not given your money in hand. You give them the name, they send the money. And they cannot give all your money, they have to remain with some of your money. It was really, really hard. And I tried, I really tried, because I could not imagine now going back. I cannot pay my flight, and I cannot pay back the money. So I had to wait until the 2 years contract expires so that I can come back home.
Thank you for having me. So as you may know, I'm based in Bahrain, and it's the smallest of the 6 countries that make up the GCC countries, the others being Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and UAE. And they're all in close proximity along the Persian Gulf. So although these countries like all have their own socio-political and cultural specificities, what they all share in common in varying degrees is their dependence on oil for revenues, and of course the Kafala system that we're going to talk about. And also, of course, the Arabic language and Islamic culture. And I think like around today, around 30 million migrants are living in this geographic area, and um, and are subjected to the kafala system. Now, kafala is basically where the sponsor assumes legal responsibility and representation over the sponsored migrant labor within the country. The word kafala itself has its roots in Sharia law, in which a party, say kafil, provides a legal guarantee on behalf of another party, which is in Arabic called makful, similar to a guarantor, if you say. However, as a system and its practice as a labor migration system in particular, it has really nothing to do with Islamic law or culture. In fact, its origins can be traced to the British colonial era in the region, where the British colonial administrators introduced the sponsorship requirements in order to control labor migration in the pearl industry um, shortly before the discovery of oil in the region. And its use was further regularized and widely applied with increasing migrant labor coming to the Gulf. And today it's been put in place in practice through an extensive body of bureaucratic procedures that regulate the relationship between the sponsor or the employer, the migrant, and the state. So to like just put it in like give the tenets of kafala, and although these vary across these Gulf countries and across time, the main tenets of kafala could be said, it's the entry and residency visa. No worker can enter this region without a local sponsor who only can obtain this visa. Most of the time, it is a national. And then exit visas as well, like a visa for the migrant to exit the country. Today, only Saudi Arabia has this restriction, and no objection certificates or change in employment. So a certificate is required before a migrant can change jobs, in which the current sponsor declares he or she has no objection uh, to the worker transferring jobs. So almost all foreign residents are in this region are regulated by kafala, with the exception of course, investors or those who bought properties and can tie their residency to their property or investment and not to a sponsor. So overall, like this is the
we are aware from in this part of the world, of course, that, and we see a lot of media coverage on Kafala and on the experiences of migrant workers in not just GCC states, but also other countries in the Middle East. So just clarification really on which countries prescribe to Kafala, and would you describe it as a form of labor policy or law? Because you've talked about it being regulatory procedures, but would you really describe it as a law or as a policy? And then just quite secondly, moving tied to that, in terms of what, in practical terms, what does it mean for migrant workers from Kenya and from other parts of the world?
So as I said, like the countries that operate under the Kafala system to varying degrees is Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and Lebanon and Jordan to certain degrees as well. And there are around the world as well, like other countries like Singapore or other places that have something similar for some migrant workers that tie their residency to an employer. So it's not just exclusively to the Gulf, but it's widely used here. Now, it's important to note that this is not really a labor law, but a system that regulates migration. And I say this because people and the media at times can get these things mixed, and governments sometimes use labor reforms as PR to say that we have abolished kafala. So when Lebanon, Qatar, or Bahrain implemented reforms in its labor laws, many were quick to point that this is the end of kafala. But the main tenets of kafala are still in place. As long as the residency of a migrant is tied to the private employer, kafala system is in place. But while kafala is not a labor law, it is a work-tied residency system, which intrinsically gives disproportionate power to employers. So as the state delegates responsibility to the employers come to wield power to control migrant workers, movements, and their labor. So an employer can terminate or threaten to deport a migrant worker, and this power can and is misused, by many employers in the Gulf and other places. For example, like say if a worker tries to, file a complaint against an employer, the employer has the power, because the state has delegated responsibility to him, to file absconding charges, or which is when workers leave the place of employment. This can prevent migrants from leaving the country or hinder justice when workers file the complaint, as you said, or subject them to deportation. If that answered your question.
It does, Ali. Thank you for that. And I guess maybe just speaking more about what you've mentioned about reforms. From what we've read, Bahrain was the first country in the GCC to work towards improving its kafala-related regulations. Would you say, and especially in 2020, because this has been a very interesting year for everyone around the world, and difficult in many ways, in more ways than one, have things improved for migrant workers since these reforms, I believe, first started in 2009, and particularly when you think about migrant domestic workers?
In 2009, the Bahraini government basically issued a decree allowing all migrant workers to change jobs, without the current sponsor's approval, provided that they notify the employer at a certain time. But what happened is that employers fiercely resisted this move, and the government amended this decision in 2011. This required a migrant worker to work for at least 1 year to be allowed to transfer sponsorship without approval. But this did have some help for migrants to, like, it materially helped migrants to change employers, say, after a year. However, it's the transfer rates of jobs is low, in part because low-income workers often lack resources and guidance to change their employment. It's not a very easy process. And for example, like Qatar recently as well removed the no objection certificate for workers to change employers, given that they give a proper notice period. But implementation has been a bit difficult, and a lot of times migrants need assistance with that. And when it comes to domestic workers in Bahrain, like, they remain excluded from critical protections, like such as fixed minimum wage limit, like any limits to working hours, mandatory rest hours, and weekly day offs, and so on. So, like, I think, like, in my opinion, Bahrain is, one of the worst countries in terms of providing legal framework for domestic workers, although they were the first countries to introduce reforms and include domestic workers partially, in a very little articles in the labor law. But as it is today, domestic workers are still subjected to horrific working conditions and conditions that amount to human trafficking and so on. And the reforms that came after 2009, such as, like, in 2017, Bahrain introduced flexi permit work that allows migrant workers to self-sponsor themselves. And also in 2018, Bahrain enacted a decree to against sexual harassment in the workplace. All these two reforms, like, domestic workers have been excluded from. So we haven't, like, seen, not just in Bahrain, but in the Gulf, like, a lot of the reforms has been excluding domestic workers in general.
Thank you very much for that, Ali. And my final question to you is very specific to the experiences of what you've seen actually in Bahrain. And given that migrant rights, the organization that you work for also, has a regional mandate. You work in other countries as well, in the GCC. Maybe you can share some of the observations you've had this year in terms of the experiences of Kenyan migrant workers, both male and female. Obviously, we understand that there's a high demand for domestic workers in Bahrain and other countries in the region. But perhaps if you could just share the experiences of Kenyan migrant workers in Bahrain and the rest of the GCC. And then maybe you can share with us as well in terms of data, numbers. How many Kenyans are we seeing currently working in Bahrain? What sectors are they working in? And as I said, how would you describe their experiences, especially this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, sure. Kenyan migration to Bahrain, and I think in Gulf in general, has been quite a recent phenomena. Like, there's been a gradual increase in migration from Kenya, mainly due to the higher cost of recruitment and wages of regular workers or domestic workers from other countries that either signed a bilateral agreement with Bahrain or other Gulf countries for minimum wages and so on. In Bahrain, there are majority of the Kenyan workers in Bahrain, though they are little in number compared to other places. They work majority in the service sector, security, cleaning companies, and domestic work. And what they face here is what, to large degree, what many low-income migrants face, who are subjected to migrant Kafala system. And what we see, especially with Kenya here, is that with Kenyan migrants, is that many domestic workers come here, um, and they've been told that they have a job for them in, like, say, school or in a cleaning company. But when they come here, they end up as domestic work. And I'm sure Ida will speak about her experiences here. And what happens is that when they come here, and they find out that it's not, the contract is not, or the job is not what was promised back home, and they end up leaving the workplace. And almost every time the employer lodges an absconding charges against them that renders them irregular, and they just stay stranded in Bahrain, unable to work in another place, or find a regular way to find income, and or subject to arrests and deportations. And since the pandemic, things, all these has been exacerbated. Many many migrants who back then they could, like, for example, work irregularly or work in cleaning companies, their jobs, they have been terminated, and it's been difficult for them to earn any income. And then because they have absconding charges on them, they cannot leave the country, so they're just stranded here, depending on charity or social workers to remove those absconding charges and get them tickets to go back home. And these are the main issues. And of course, like, since the pandemic, basically no one is paying anyone right now in Bahrain, and we have an astronomically high cases of wage theft, non-payment of wages, and labor abuses, and many other issues like that.
Thank you for that, Ali. I guess in terms of data, statistics, I see on the presentation that you say there are about 2,000, just over 2,000 workers with regular work permits. But in terms of the total number of Kenyan migrant workers in Bahrain, both documented and undocumented, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
I can say, because, like, even these datas are, like, the Gulf countries have this problem of lack of transparency, and it's very difficult to get data about these things. And like, these data is from 2019, and it's hard to say, like, how many are irregular. But even, like, in this, given that there are only few thousand numbers, it is the case that there are a lot of Kenyans that seek to us for help, which means that, a big number of them are having issues here. A lot of it, has to do with the recruitment channels not being proper, and like, for example, what happened to Ida, which she will explain. And there is also these in Bahrain, like this article that is mentioned in the presentation, like, there is this thing, like, kind of ethos with the Bahraini recruitment agencies and in the media. They tend to not only use, racist and language towards, migrants specifically from Africa, but Kenyan domestic workers here, like this article from September, like, it mentions, like, Kenyans are, quote unquote, like, it's not my language, but prone to, leave the abscond from the employment's house, not mentioning though why they leave the place. what were they told before coming. And of course, it's a human right to have the, it's a human right to have the right to leave the employment place whenever you want. So, but as to go back to your question, it's very difficult to know, but how many are rendered irregular with this. But the problem is the lack of support that are there, both from the government not providing adequate support and shelter for specifically for Kenyan domestic workers, given that they don't have any kind of embassy representation here, which makes their plight here more difficult.
Thank you for that, Ali. And I have just one final question before we move on to Ida. You've mentioned absconding charges, and perhaps you can just share some more information around that, because from this part of the world, we're not very clear about what happens if a worker wants to leave, and especially, again, domestic worker who is more vulnerable than other workers, such as workers who are working in the construction sector, for instance, or workers who are working in the service industry, who do not live within their employer's place of abode. So just perhaps if you could maybe provide more information about that, what you mean by this absconding charges, and what alternatives that the migrant, especially a migrant domestic worker, have if they no longer want to continue working for their employer.
So absconding charges, like, just to say, it's because of the Kafala system, employers have quote unquote responsibilities over the workers, and absconding charges is a way of employers, mechanism employers use when the worker is not at the workplace, and that, like, by the system, employer is responsible for where the worker is. So when the worker is not there, you can file absconding charges. But what happens is that usually employers misuse that to file charges again in order to hinder any kind of movement of the employer or access to justice in case they are not paid, or travel abroad in some cases. In the case of domestic workers, it's more acute because they live within the employer's house. So in times of where there is abuse or any sort of labor abuse, physical abuse, and the domestic worker leaves to go to complain at the police station or anything, the employer right then could file an absconding charge, making this process of the domestic worker accessing justice harder, and at some points even impossible. And there are all sorts of ways that could do it. And even legally, in practice, there's things that are worse for domestic workers. Say, while workers in regular places like construction and other places, when an employer wants to file an absconding charge, say at the government labor ministry, usually there are a number of days that should go past that the employee is not there, and then they could file this absconding charges. Whereas for domestic workers, they can do it immediately at the police station, and then that would make everything harder for the domestic worker to seek justice.
Thank you. We heard from Ali, and of course we know that Lebanon is not part of the GCC, but it prescribes to Kafala. I mean, are there regulations and requirements for recruitment and residence of migrant domestic workers similar to what Ali described in Bahrain, or is the system quite different in Lebanon?
Yeah, in Lebanon, really the only requirements are that the people who are supposed to get paid. And so as long as the right people are all getting paid, you can do whatever you want. And part of the reason is that there actually is no legal framework for Kafala in Lebanon. And so everything hinges on General Security's mandate for issuing visas. And the ministry, and I do very much agree with Ali of how the news and other kind of sources, as they engage with this, try to call it a labor issue and really narrow down the scope. And of course, it is a labor issue, but it's so much bigger than that. And so, like in Lebanon, there's one law that has kind of anything to do with labor, and that law is that migrant domestic workers are excluded from all labor law. And so there is no really the Ministry of Labor guidelines, the contracts that they have and all that, for a variety of reasons, they're not enforceable by the worker in almost any scenario. And so it's all just this one-sided relationship where the system functions just as a property ownership system for the employers to have full control and autonomy over these people who come to work for them. And of course, there are some employers who want to treat workers well as human beings, but there's many who aren't. And it's just the roll of the dice. It's a gamble on what type of employer you're getting. And there's no mechanisms in the legal system in the country for any sort of restitution or justice for employers who want to act otherwise. In General Security, as you know, they're the ones who are truly kind of created the system and keep it moving from day to day. They get a large amount of their money from the system, so they have a very vested interest through the visas. And just time and time again, as we observe them, how they respond to situations that they're responding, and just without any regard for the worker, acting in the interest of the employer.
Thank you, Zain. Maybe before I move on to my next question, just a point of clarification. You've talked about the general security, but maybe for the sake of our Kenyan listeners who might not be very familiar with the context in Lebanon, what is the general security, and what is their mandate exactly?
Yeah, so general security, they're under the Ministry of Interior, and they're just kind of your basic, what you think of as police. But so you go to the police station, that's general security. But in Lebanon, I don't know about like in Kenya what the police do. In Lebanon, for instance, general security generally does a lot more than maybe police would most often do. And so, like, the fact that the same people who are just doing like normal police duties are also the ones signing visas, enforcing visas, things like that, I think is quite unusual and a very problematic system that specifically comes down to bear pretty hard on the migrant domestic workers.
Thank you for that, Zain. So over the years, we've seen different actors, including trade unions, activists from all over the world, non-profit organizations as well, and migrant workers themselves call for the abolishment of the Kafala system. What do you think has driven these demands? And of course, we've seen that happening in Lebanon as well. What do you think is driving these demands for the complete abolishment of Kafala?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll just run through real quick. This is the list of abuses that we also see through Kafala. And because of a combination of the mechanisms that Kafala has created and kind of the racism that both it perpetuates as well as drives it, allows, and that includes child labor, false detention or imprisonment, human trafficking. It's, murders go without investigation almost every single time. There's often suicides or failed escapes. A worker will attempt to escape through a second or third story floor. No question is asked about why, what exactly is going on. There's restrictions on freedom of movement for almost every single worker. We actually only record when there's no restriction on freedom of movement, which has never happened with one of our cases. If you take the Rome definition of torture, which is the one that the International Criminal Court uses, that it includes psychological torture. And so every single one of our cases experiences at least that form of torture. Non-payment of salary, overworking, often over 100 hours a week, 80 to 90 is very normal. Physical abuse, refusing to send home, just keeping them as forced labor. Sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, untreated illness or injury. I think Ida told that as part of her story, and that's very common. Starvation, and then just being thrown out in the street when they're supposed to be a responsible party for this person's well-being. So those are all things that we've consistently seen, and I think others have seen that often as well. And that's, it's like, why would there be a system that allows these things and there to be no avenue for restitution or justice for anyone who experiences them? When Dipendra worked at the honorary consulate, the Nepali honorary consulate in Beirut, he saw 72 women go home in caskets, in coffins, and only one of them was there an arrest. And there was an arrest because the murderer was a Syrian man. And so they were willing to arrest a Syrian man, but not a Lebanese man. And then even as we've tried through many avenues, through international lawyers from an organization that's taken cases to the International Criminal Court, to some of the top human rights organizations in Lebanon, we've never seen really one case of what you'd see like, wow, this is a success. The closest thing was a woman who was raped by her employer, who's a police officer. She took the case to the court. Criminal charges were not even being considered. But through the civil court, she got a settlement of a few $1,000s. And that was only because she was pregnant with his baby. But most often in those scenarios, the employer just forces the worker, takes her to the doctor and forces her to get an abortion just to hide the evidence. So most times that's not even an option. And so it's not, modern day slavery is a little bit of an understatement. It's just state-sponsored slavery, and it's beyond slavery because it's mixed with almost every type of human rights abuse you can imagine as just being something that's allowed and perpetuated by the system.
Thank you, Wayne. So if kafala was to be abolished, then what should replace it? What is the ideal policy or law or regulation that should govern the recruitment of foreign workers in countries like Lebanon and elsewhere in the Middle East? What is the ideal situation in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that I say with this is, as conditions currently exist in Lebanon, I don't have confidence that any of these measures that have been implemented in the Gulf would actually work as a functional system in aiding the real problems that migrant domestic workers are facing. Earlier this year, there was a big celebration of the end of Kafala in Lebanon, because they have this new big unified contract. And first off, we said from the beginning, right after they announced it, it was a faux attempt at reforming or abolishing Kafala. The contract, there's already a contract, and that contract, it's up to the goodwill of the employer on whether they want to enforce it or uphold it. And there is no enforcement against it, except for the enforcement against the worker. So it's a one-sided contract, and there's no new enforcement mechanism in the new proposed contract, so that the worker can have someone who is with them to have it enforced against the employer. And so without that enforcement mechanism, it's just as worthless as the last contract. What it does do is it sets a standard of norms. And so employers who do want to follow the rules, yeah, sure, they'll probably, some people will get better conditions through the goodwill of their employers, just because their employers want to follow the rules. But it's not because the state is fundamentally changing in a way to reorient itself to provide rights for workers. And even the person who proposed the new contract, the caretaker minister of labor, when she was interviewed afterwards about the problems of Kafala, she actually blamed it on the fact that there were so many illegal domestic workers and that she only had 10 labor inspectors. Well, we don't even see those 10 labor inspectors really doing anything regardless. That's a much larger team than we have in terms of direct caseworkers. And so she abdicated all responsibility from the Ministry of Labor and actually doing anything about that. But even with all of that, we can't officially confirm this, but have been told this, have reason to believe it, that the proposed reforms that are supposed to come through have already been rejected. And it makes sense that they would be rejected because it's in the law that domestic workers are excluded from all labor laws. So how's the minister going to enact labor rights for migrant domestic workers? And even if that one part of the law, there's just so many interested parties, especially as the economy worsens, the Lebanese have less and less ability to have domestic workers, and they've relied on them so heavily that they're not keen with the idea of these employers and agencies aren't keen with the idea of having even less access to domestic workers. And so I think in terms of what it would take for conditions in Lebanon to change so that it would be livable and suitable conditions for migrant domestic workers, it would take just an entirely new mandate, entirely new kind of organization working or something that's collaborating with some of the leaders from the migrant domestic worker community. What we see in the Lebanese state as a government is that just the level of disregard and racism is so severe that you can't have people who are operating under those premises who are going to bring any sort of justice or equity to workers.
Thank you so much, Zain.